This is Lecture 7b. So last time I talked about empires in classical India, and I talked about the religion of Jainism. And so now I'm going to talk about the second religion that emerges out of India at this time period in the 500s and 400s BCE, and that's Buddhism. Okay. Now, just as Jainism emerges out of the sort of Vedic religion and the Upanishads and things like that, and Jainism was built around this idea of samsara, this cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and you have your soul has a karmic burden that determines how you're reborn in the next life. Buddhism accepts that also. Buddhism accepts the idea that souls are continually reborn in a cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and that this cycle of life, death, and rebirth is a form of suffering, right? That life involves lots of suffering. And so the goal, of course, is to escape from that suffering through moksha, or escape, release. Well, in Buddhism, the founding figure is Siddhartha Gautama, who lived from 563 BCE to 483 BCE. And I want you to notice, he's contemporary with Vardhamana Mahavira. He's contemporary with Kong Fuji, founder of Confucianism in China. And so he's really, there's something percolating here. All these new religions appear at the beginning of the classical era, and often almost within decades of each other. Well, Siddhartha, initially, he went and he planned to spend his life being an ascetic. He was sort of on the same path as Vardhamana Mahavira, and he wanted to. For 6 years, he practiced an asceticism, trying to deny himself food and water and sex and anything that's luxurious or too pleasurable or sensual. But he realizes that he really doesn't feel like he's getting anywhere. And so the story goes that one night he renounces asceticism. He says, this is the wrong path. And in particular, when I focus on denying myself food, all I do is think about food all the time, right? And it distracts me, and I really can't focus on anything else. And so it just becomes this sort of stupid struggle to deny myself something. And so Siddhartha Gautama sat down under a tree, a lotus tree, and he meditated that night and he thought about it. And the story goes that he was visited by four great desires. He was visited by death and greed and lust and anger, and they all tempted him and they all tried to take over him, and he struggled with all of them, but he defeated all of them. He defeated death and lust and greed and anger. And in the morning, he realized he had found the truth. He had found enlightenment. And so, in particular, what he had realized during the night was what he called the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are sort of the heart of Buddhism. The first is that human existence is suffering, right? That's just inextricable. To live is to suffer, right? So that's the first noble truth. But the second one is where it gets interesting. He says the source of suffering is not the external world out there. It's your own desire that things be different. You only suffer if you want something different than what already exists, right? So suppose suppose you're sitting around and you're nice, you're not hungry or anything, and you're happy, right? You're like, oh yes, I feel pretty good. But then suppose you have the thought of a chocolate chip cookie, and you're like, oh, I really want a chocolate chip cookie. Well, now you have your desire for a chocolate chip cookie has created a form of suffering. You've got a lack now. Before you didn't want a chocolate chip cookie, but now that you desire a chocolate chip cookie, you don't have one. You're short one chocolate chip cookie, and this is a suffering in life. And so what Gautama realizes is that the desire itself is the source of the suffering. The gap between our desires and reality is where suffering comes from. If there was no gap between what we wanted and what the world was like, we'd be happy. So that's the second noble truth, is that desire is the source of all suffering. And then, of course, the third truth follows from that. The way to extinguish suffering is to extinguish desire. If you desire for nothing to be different than it is, then you're happy with what is, and you no longer suffer, right? And so the ultimate goal of Buddhism then is to get to this state where you have given up on all desires. You are totally at peace with the world as it is, and you have no desire that the world be different than it is, and therefore you have no desire. And how do you get there, though? How do you achieve this state of no desire? Well, that's the Eightfold Path. And the fourth Noble Truth is that the way to do this is called the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths then are that life is full of suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. The way to overcome suffering is to extinguish desire. And the way to do that is the Eightfold Path. Okay? So what's the Eightfold Path? Well, the Eightfold Path is just sort of 8 different aspects of living your life correctly. I mean, the one path, the first one is called right views, which means you're supposed to recognize the truths of Buddhism. And then one is right resolve. So you're supposed to resolve, I'm really going to try to live, do what Buddhism says. And then there's right living. So you're going to have to make your living in a way that doesn't, increase your karmic burden and distract you into all sorts of other desires and things like that. So a lot of the first 6 paths of the Eightfold Path are basically sort of how you get yourself ready to try to extinguish all desire. It's the last 2 which are the really interesting ones. These are right mindfulness and right concentration. And right mindfulness is a way of meditation and self-reflection that allows you to overcome your own desires. But even then, you have subconscious desires, and your brain is going below. And so right consciousness is using meditation to actually sort of calm even your subconscious, even your unconscious urges. And if you can do both of those things, you will have extinguished all desire. You will be totally at peace with the world because you have totally accepted that the world is exactly as it is, and that your fate is exactly what your fate is, and you want it to be no different. And part of this is that you have to realize that everything is really a unified whole. There's no me and you. We're all part of one unified whole. And so if if I die, that doesn't matter because the whole goes on. And if I'm suffering a little bit, but somebody else is happy, that balances out. So if you can really realize that we're all connected, we're all part of a unified whole, it allows you to extinguish desires for yourself much more easily. If you can extinguish desire, you achieve a state called nirvana. And so Buddhists call it, this nirvana means the extinguishing of desire, putting out the fire, but it actually means extinguishing desire. And this is the Buddhist version of moksha, or release from the cycle. So if you achieve a state of having no desire, if you extinguish all desire through the Eightfold Path, then you have achieved enlightenment. You have no longer have any desires. And when you die, you will die your true death, and your soul will not be reborn anymore. Instead, your soul will essentially join the universe, and you won't be reborn as an individual again. But one interesting thing about this is that Buddhists argue that Siddhartha Gautama, he achieved enlightenment, but he spent decades of his life then traveling India and teaching others. He took on disciples and students, and he taught people because he realized that was the way for other people to gain enlightenment. He would be selfish to just take this enlightenment and die and be happy. He had to spend time teaching others. And so in Buddhism, Gautama himself, Siddhartha Gautama, is called the Buddha, the enlightened one. But a person who achieves enlightenment and then goes to teach others and doesn't choose the final death, but rather chooses to teach others, or even to come back again and live another life so they can teach more people, that person is called a bodhisattva. And so Siddhartha was the first Buddha. He's also the first bodhisattva. And so this is the core idea of Buddhism, is that you will practice, there's all the Eightfold Path, and learn how to sort of extinguish all desire, right? And if you can do that and control your own mind to the extent that you can erase all desire, then you can achieve nirvana. Now, the way Siddhartha Gautama presented it, this is a pretty rigorous path. It's a really hard thing to do. It takes years of stuff. It takes most people years of study and meditation and reading different teachings in order to figure out how to really achieve right mindfulness and right concentration, or right consciousness rather. And so, as Buddhism emerged after Buddha's death in 483, it began to split apart because some people wanted to follow it one way and some people wanted to follow it another way. And so I want to talk about three different sort of movements. The first is Theravada Buddhism. And this sort of Buddhism is still predominant in southern India, Sri Lanka, but also in Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, Southeast Asia. This sort of Buddhism is a very austere version that's pretty close to the original teachings of the Buddha, in that it's pretty much says you've got to just give up everything in life and you're going to focus on the Eightfold Path, and you're going to spend your life in a monastery or practicing meditation, etc., to the neglect of everything else, and you're going to achieve enlightenment that way. So it's rather austere. It involves lots of texts and reading a whole lot to gain insight and wisdom into how you do meditation and what the universe is like, etc. And then it involves lots of practice, meditation, etc. So it's not something that a lot of people really felt they could do. You got to give up everything and just sort of dedicate your life to this. It's not something a lot of people were ready to do. Now, Theravada Buddhism is still a very vibrant form of Buddhism. But people began to look for other ways of sort of engaging with these ideas of Buddhism without having to just lock yourself up for decades for the rest of your life. And so you saw the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism it's called the greater vehicle. That's what Mahayana means. It means it's accessible to more people. And so Mahayana Buddhism, it has a couple of things. First of all, it's far less intellectual. It focuses on sort of intuition and the idea that you can achieve enlightenment maybe without having to do all those years of study. You can do it instead by sort of intuitive meditation, and you can sort of understand how to do it. And so it makes the path potentially much shorter. But it also offers the idea that people in one life might not be ready to try to achieve nirvana, but they could take the first steps on the Eightfold Path. They could sort of commit themselves. They could embrace the ideas of Buddhism, and that's the right views, the first path, and they could try to make a have the right livelihood, and they could do the preliminary steps in this lifetime, and then in another lifetime be ready to really take the jump and dedicate themselves to achieving nirvana. And so Mahayana Buddhism develops lots of rituals that people who are not in monasteries and are not going to spend their whole lives doing this, they can do to sort of do the preliminary work of achieving nirvana. And it involves also lots of things like festivals, and there are different practices, and you give money to monasteries to help pay for food, etc., for other people who are trying to achieve nirvana. And so it becomes a much more what you might call a livable religion, in the sense that it's easier to sort of engage and practice and get into. And so, and Mahayana Buddhism, therefore, spreads pretty easily. I mean, this is a religion people can embrace. And so it spreads pretty far. It spreads across northern India, but then it spreads up into China. It spreads to Japan. It spreads along the Silk Roads into the Middle East. And we'll see it show up again elsewhere. I'm going to talk about China and Zen Buddhism, and I'll talk about what happens to Buddhism when it gets into the Middle East. And so Mahayana Buddhism really spreads, which is why it's called the greater vehicle. Much later, in the 600s CE, so a good 800 years after Buddha, you see another version emerge in Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet. And this has a whole new set of secret texts about achieving enlightenment and all sorts of new types of practices for achieving enlightenment. And so this is also a very popular form of Buddhism, but it's restricted much more to Tibet. So this is Buddhism, and Buddhism is, it's a fantastic religion in the sense that it offers people a way of making sense of life, and it offers them a hope of escaping from suffering, and it offers them a path of action they can take. And especially Mahayana Buddhism is way easier to approach than, say, Jainism, which is so ascetic and involves so much self-deprivation, etc. And so Buddhism spreads quite a bit, but what's interesting is that Buddhism is actually, as a religion, from a historian's point of view, we're going to be asking, and I'll talk about this in discussion, we're going to be asking, are religions really good for a stable society or not? And different religions are different. And what we're going to see is that Jainism and Buddhism both have this radical idea of equality, that everybody is equal in their path. And they also have this idea that you can just step out of society and renounce everything, right? The whole point of Jainism was asceticism. You're not going to eat, you're not going to drink, you're not going to have sex, you're not going to own possessions, you're not going to do anything like that. Well, that's not going to help build a good economy or society if everybody did that. And Buddhism, similarly, if everyone follows the Eightfold Path, they're going to renounce all desire, and that means they really don't have the desire to make money or produce stuff or work or et cetera. And so Buddhism and Jainism are kind of destabilizing. And we have a little taste of this in Ashoka because, Ashoka he's the emperor of the Mauryan Empire, but he adopts Buddhism and he becomes disgusted with conquest, and he basically begins to focus much more on meditation and his own salvation, and he raises his children that way, and the empire actually starts to fall apart because the emperors, the people running it, are simply not that interested anymore. And so we can see that Buddhism then, initially at least, is not that conducive to building a stable society. It can't be the foundation of a great civilization, and especially not a great empire, because it's too pacifist. And so we're going to see that the third religion that emerges in India at this time period, Hinduism, actually does a much better job, because it's a different religion. It does a much better job of being the foundation of a stable social order. So we're going to see how that goes in the third part of this lecture.